Good day, my dear students. Welcome to our science class. Before we start our new lesson, let us have a review on our previous lesson by having a short game. Unscramble the letters inside the parentheses to identify some terms used in describing the different interaction of organisms in their environment. Number 1. It is a complex relationship between all the living and the non-living things interacting with each other. The answer is ecosystem. Number 2. The variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. The answer is biodiversity. 3. A place where an organism makes its home. The answer is habitat. Number 4, a group of individuals of the same species living and interbreeding within a given area. The answer is population. Now this time, let's try to see the following pictures. What can you see in the picture? Very good. That is an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a community or group of living organisms that live in and interact with each other in a specific environment, or the interaction between the living things and non-living things. Now guys, how does energy become transferred from one organism to another? Energy is transferred between trophic levels when one organism eats another organism. How about the next picture? What do you see in the picture? What do you call the series of energy flow? Very good. It is a food chain. A food chain is how an energy flow in the ecosystem. And this flow starts from the producers, which is eaten by the primary consumers, who are then eaten by secondary consumers, to higher level of consumers, and finally, decomposers. That is how energy flows from one trophic level to another. So class, do you have any idea now on what is our lesson for today? Very good. So for today, our lesson is all about the interactions which focus on the food chain and the food web. And our objectives, at the end of the lesson, you should be able to, number 1, distinguish a food chain from a food web. Second, identify the producers, consumers, and decomposers in a food chain and a food web. And number 3, analyze the transfer of energy from one organism to another. And here is our guide questions. What is a food chain and a food web? How is energy transferred from one organism to another? And number 3, distinguish between a producer, consumer, and decomposers. Okay, class? Before we go further with our new lesson, now let's have the activity number 1 entitled Follow the Food Chain. Study the figure illustration, then read the paragraph, and after that, answer the guide questions. All living things need the energy from food. Green plants are the only living things that can make their own food. For that reason, they are called producers. Animals are consumers because they eat plants or other animals to get their energy. Decomposers are consumers that break down dead plants and animals. They return materials stored in dead plants and animals to the soil, water, and air. Then green plants use these materials to make food. A food chain always begins with the producer. The first consumer in a food chain is an herbivore, an animal that eats only plants. The next consumer is a carnivore, an animal that eats only other animals. A carnivore may be eaten by a larger carnivore. A food chain sometimes includes consumer that is omnivore, an animal that eats both plants and animals. We will now answer the guide questions of the activity. Direction is, identify whether the statements pertain to consumers, producers, decomposers, herbivore, carnivore, and omnivore. Number 1. It is a fungus that breaks down dead plants and animals. Second, organisms that makes its own food. Third, a living thing that cannot make its own food. Number 4, organisms that eats both plants and animals. Number 5, organisms that feeds only on plants. And number 6, an organism that mostly eats meat or the flesh of animals. Okay, let's check if your answers are correct. Number 1, the answer is decomposers. Second, the answer is producers. Third, the answer is consumer. Fourth, the answer is omnivore. 5, the answer is herbivore. And number 6, the answer is carnivore. What was your score? Did you get all the items correctly? If you do, then I will give you 2 thumbs up. Very good, everyone. So now, you learn from your activity how food chain flow in the ecosystem. A food chain consists of several organisms linked together by an eat-on-eater relationship. Each organism affects the survival of other organisms in the chain. If an organism in this series is removed or destroyed, the food chain breaks. Food chain includes the following organisms: the primary consumer, which eat autotrophs or what we call the producers. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. The tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers. Decomposers, the bacteria and fungi that break down organisms and recycle the material back into the environment. Here is an example of a food chain. Plants eaten by a deer, which is the primary consumer, eaten by a lion, the secondary consumer, and a decomposers. So this is a simple example of a food chain. A food chain is a simple version of what is actually happens in nature. So what about food web? A food web shows the complex food relationship of organisms in a given area. It shows the cyclic flow of food through organisms. In this chart, here an example of a food web. A grass can be eaten by both a rabbit and a grasshopper, and this mouse can be eaten by a snake and kookaburra. Also, these snakes can be eaten by eagle and a kookaburra. So a food web is a network of food chain by which nutrients and energy are passed on from one species of living organisms to another species. Now you know about a food chain and a food web.
Food chain shows the transfer of energy within an ecosystem. Energy is transferred between organisms when one organism eats another. Food chain is a simple version of what actually happens in nature. But everything is not so simple. This looks complex in a food web. The food web shows overlapping pathways of energy in the ecosystem. It is a combination of all the food chains.
In a food web, organisms place into different trophic levels. Food web is a network of food chains by which nutrients and energy are passed on from one species of living organisms to another.
So class, how will you differentiate a food chain from a food web? A food chain consists of several organisms linked together by an eat-on-eater relationship, while a food web shows the complex food relationship of organisms in a given area, and it shows the cyclic flow of food through organisms. What is the role of decomposers in the food chain and the food web? Decomposers clean up the dead materials by processing it and returning the nutrients to the soil for the producers. An example of these are the fungi and bacteria. Next question. Without decomposers, will producers and consumers stay alive? Why? No. Decomposers act on dead organisms and change these to simple nutrients which plants can use again. Without decomposers, nutrients needed by producers will not be available. Producers cannot stay alive. What about if, without producers, will consumers stay alive? Why? Without producers, there will be no food for consumers. Now is the quiz time. Let's answer the assessment in this module. Direction is, it is a fact or a bluff. Examine the given question carefully. Identify if the statements are presenting facts or not. Number 1. Energy moves from one trophic level to another. Second, food web may be interconnected to form a food chain. Number 3. Decomposers act on dead organisms and change these to simple nutrients. Number 4. The feeding of one organism upon another in a series of energy transfer is known as a food chain. Number 5. Without producers, there will be no food for consumers. Letter B, multiple choice. Direction is, choose the letter of the correct answer. Number 1. A type of consumers that eat both meat and plants is called the blank. A. Herbivore. B. Omnivore. C. Carnivore. D. Producer. 2. Blank is an example of decomposers. A. Fish. B. Plants. C. Bacteria. D. Seaweeds. Number 3. A blank makes its own energy and begins the food chain. A. Consumer. B. Producer. C. Carnivore. D. Decomposer. Number 4. A diagram that shows the transfer of energy in one line is a blank. A. Food web. B. Food line. C. Food chain. D. Food court. And number 5. A blank cannot make its own energy and eats only plants for their energy. A. Producer. B. Primary consumer. C. Tertiary consumer. D. Secondary consumer. This time, we will now check your work. Number 1 answer is fact. Second, bluff. Third, fact. Number 4, fact. Number 5, fact. For letter B answers, multiple choice. Number 1, B. 2, C. 3B, 4C, and 5B. Once again, congratulations everyone. We will now be able to explain what is a food chain and a food web. Goodbye everyone. See you again next time. Thanks for listening.